Hey guys, welcome to book review number 36, I believe. Today I will be reviewing Lhasa Streets with Memories by Robert Barnett. I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, this is a slim volume. I think it's only about 140 pages minus the notes and the preamble. Significantly longer with the notes and the introduction. What it's about, obviously, is it's about Lhasa and sort of the historical context of how the city developed, more focusing on modern times with China post-revolution, because obviously, well, not obviously, but as it states in the book, that's where the majority of architecture happens, but also with significant focus on pre-Chinese 1951, I want to say, or maybe 52, invasion of Tibet, and how some of the older buildings, the old dynastic families, and like the Pelota Palace, which is the home of the Dalai Lama, came into being. He focuses on, I think, four sorts of views of the outline of the city. One is the unitary view, foreign visitors, oscillations and extreme, the square view, and outstretched demoness, the city the circle, monumental statements and street plans, from concrete to blue glass, the new flamboyance, and the Tibetan palm tree, and the two narratives converge, and the last one is multi-layered streets. Those are essentially the chapters. He sort of talks about, in the beginning, how the history of Tibet was not as Unitarian as we often like to believe. It's often viewed as Tibet was a happy realm, but he mentions that many Tibetans actually welcomed the coming of the Chinese army because they felt that they could use their alliance with the Chinese army to essentially oust their enemies. The Sera monks, who are a powerful sect of monks within Tibet, are one of these groups, and they've actually gained more prominence since China has taken over. And they aligned with China to essentially help oust, and a lot of the legitimacy of or that China claims in its invasion of Tibet was signed by these Sera monks in peace accords or deals of unification with China. And China constantly cites those, even though most of those were signed either by splinter groups from what would be considered the main government of Tibet at the time, Dalai Lama, etc., or under duress. So people that might have been aligned with the government but signed just because the Chinese kind of forced them to. He also talks about some of the historical way that Tibet developed. Tibet was kind of an independent kingdom, I guess you'd say, under the Dalai Lama from about 900 AD, with various peaks of federation or confederation, power centered in the capital of Lhasa at various points between 900 and 1950 for about 1,000 years. He mentions that the first founder of Tibet, and that the first oh geez, I'm getting distracted. The first founder of Tibet was actually married a Chinese princess, I guess you'd say, or someone within the harem of the Emperor of China. Um, and according to Chinese accounts, this woman moved to Tibet and then helped co-found the city of Lhasa, whereas in, I guess you'd say, Tibetan exile, or really the anti-Chinese view of Lhasa. Lhasa is the capital, obviously. I should have said that from the start. That this man, and I think it's like Gamta something, founded the city, and then as a point, a strategic point in which to take over surrounding areas, in which case he became powerful, in which case he went to China, got the mistress, or got the, I guess, wife or bride from the Chinese harem, and then brought her back to Lhasa, in which case she developed it. But where there isn't really disagreement is the effect that this woman had on the development of Lhasa. That primarily being in a big thing that Chinese topographers look at is sort of a mixture of the raw topography of the land and what that might mean in terms of a spiritual sense or in terms of demons across the city. And one of the things that she said was that there was a demoness that was laying across all of Tibet, but was the main part of her body was concentrated in Lhasa, and this was obviously an evil demon. It needed to be repressed. So what had to happen is structures needed to be placed on prominent points on what would be considered her body, her knees, elbows, and those are kind of outside Lhasa, but within Lhasa, her breasts, her mouth, I believe what would be considered like her belly button and her vagina, essentially. And on one of those, one of the best breasts is where the Pelota Palace is now, which is the famous home and seat of the Dalai Lama, which, if you ever see a picture of Tibet, is the huge white and red kind of block building that is there. There's also the, I want to say the Jurungharda Palace. I want to get this right, because I know I'm going to mispronounce it. D-H-I-J-K... Jokhang. Yeah, the Jokhang Temple, which, despite the Pelota Palace being where the Dalai Lama lives, the Pelota Palace is actually not the center of Tibetan religion. It's this temple, which is much lower to the ground, much less prominent, much just less visually appealing than the Pelota Palace, but which actually is the center of Tibetan worship, in which people all around Tibet make pilgrimages to walk in. I think it's clockwise. Clockwise rotations around its perimeter in which to pray and offer, sort of like in Mecca. I forget what that's called, but like for Muslims what Mecca is, this is sort of like what that is for Tibetan Buddhists. Sort of in later chapters, he talks about obviously the invasion and what happened there. Interestingly enough, even though a lot of we typically think the most destructive period of Chinese history, at least modern history, is the Cultural Revolution, of course, when all across China, artifacts, ancient temples, just anything that was viewed as ancient or historical was being destroyed for the new modern Maoist way of creating a new mind for the people through architecture and surroundings. But interestingly enough, this was actually not the most destructive period in Lhasa. One being because there really wasn't much prominence given to it, because it was not viewed as central to the communist struggle within China. And two, just because it was so out of the way, not connected by any major roads, not connected up until within the last 10 years by a railway. Just too far out of the way to really engage in the Cultural Revolution. So although there were a couple buildings that were torn down and realigned, really for the most part what happened during basically from the mid-1950s, 1960s to about 1980, after Mao Zedong died, was just decay. Was the buildings were still intact, but they just weren't upkept very well. Now that changed with the modernization of China that happened during the Dongping opening, and I think they actually call it the Spring Awakening, I believe. That wasn't a term used for all of China, or maybe it was used for all of China, but anyway, it had to do with the economic liberalization of the economy in the 1980s and continued into the 90s. And what that essentially did is it didn't really work to repress Tibetan belief, although that was certainly there in the police force or whatnot, but really just to sort of outshout Tibetan belief through architectural dominance. Many of the old buildings were taken down. Now, obviously, the real big ones had to be left up because it would be, just insane to take down like the Pelota Palace or something. But a lot of the old temples were destroyed, or the lesser temples were destroyed, and to outshout, I guess you'd say, some of the monuments, huge modern concrete structures were put up. Now, this was something that was added to during the Cultural Revolution era, but actually during the cultural era of the Cultural Revolution, most of these concrete buildings were outside the city, so kind of like in satellite towns. So there really was a lot of destruction within the city of Lhasa, or the Pelota area. But as the China grew, and as it really put a lot of emphasis on its frontier regions, those being like the Mongolian Autonomous Region, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, and the Tibetan Autonomous Region, really there was a lot more people that came into Lhasa, a lot more fill-in. Like I said, lesser buildings were taken down. Concrete buildings were now not only put on the outside, but on the inside of the city. And later, towards, say, like the early 90s, it mentioned in the book, that modernist architecture started coming. So you started seeing high-rises, you started seeing steel, you started seeing the geometric shapes of ultra-modern architecture. And I think the thing that I find most interesting about this architecture is in other cities this also happens. You see like modern architecture in London, or you see modern alongside like 1,000-year-old buildings. You see modern architecture in like Bombay or Mumbai along ancient temples, or even in like the Middle Eastern areas. But what really strikes me about Lhasa is kind of the herky-jerky way in which this develops. It's like there's the old architecture, and then there's a period of growth, and then there's just like nothing, and then it's like boom, another big one of modernist architecture. And he actually mentions that this happens even in the early part of the last century, so like the early 1900s, when a lot of architectural achievements were being brought in from India to Lhasa, to Tibet, that this sort of happened, but we don't necessarily, because that style is viewed as ancient compared to our modern, we don't see how modern that was at that time period compared to buildings in Tibet that had been around for like 1,000 years or so. I'm going kind of long about this, so overall, I enjoyed the book. One thing that I really should mention that I should have mentioned earlier, is, a book about architecture or a book about a history book. A lot of people say history is dry, history is boring, but he actually incorporates his first visit to Lhasa in 1987, I want to say, 1987, when he, just by happenstance, just by pure timing, he witnessed one of the first, or really the first, major modern anti-Chinese demonstration among the Tibetan people. And this provides sort of like a very personal counterpoint. And, he kind of does a little chunk and then does a little chunk of history and does a little chunk of this event, or like kind of the aftermath of it, the surrounding events, interspersed with the history. And it really provides a good counterpoint, really gives it a personal touch. One of the things that I found, there were just a lot of really good stories. Like, there was the story of, like the Tibetan people who had participated in the demonstration, who had been shot by the Chinese army in repression of the demonstration. And these people couldn't go to the hospital because that would obviously be an admission of their guilt, and they didn't want to, obviously become guilty because of the terrible side effects obviously China would do to them, China being a pretty repressive state. So what they did is they would actually clandestine try to contact foreigners to see if they could, the few foreigners that were in the area in 1987, to give them medical help. It's a very dramatic, tense, these meetings up, because of the effect it could have upon a person. It could expose them for meeting Westerners. Obviously, that looks very suspicious, so they have to do it very clandestine. And also for the Westerners, because although the Chinese government really wouldn't punish a Westerner, for the most part, Westerners are kind of left alone, even in that time period. It would still reflect very badly upon them. One thing that he kind of, or I'll say this other thing, and then I'll say this last kind of thing about the politics. But first, the other story that I thought was really interesting is, as part of this personal thing, he wrote when there were these protests in 1987, and then he went back like 15 or 20 years later. It was like 15 years later. And kind of talked about, he actually taught in a Tibetan institution, which I think Tibet was just trying to, or the Chinese government was just trying to co-opt him. I mean, they didn't, but that was their attempt to co-opt him. And he's not necessarily a dissident, but in whatever dissidence he had in his criticism of the Chinese government, they brought him in to teach, just to kind of incorporate him in and hopefully not force him, but just kind of convince him. But anyway, he one of his students had a grandparent, and he never met with his Tibetan students because of the political risk that it would have to the students. He only met them in the classroom, not outside the classroom. But in this one instance, he met this Tibetan student, and the student took him to his, I think like 70 or 80-year-old grandpa, who had participated in some of the protests 20 years prior, maybe like 60 or 70. But, it's just really dramatic, because they went into this room that there was no furnishing, only a tiny thing of light, and this old man told him of the regret that he had in being unable to see his country free. He didn't exactly say free, but just the not being able to see his country outside of the yoke of Chinese authority. And the old man actually cried, and Robert Barnett actually mentioned that he cried too. And the last thing I guess I'll say, I talked about the politics. Obviously, one of the big warnings in the book, and I would say this to anyone traveling in the region, first of all, okay, I'll give this warning and then I'll conclude up. The warning is that really, if you talk about politics in Tibet, like liberation politics, or you talk about the Dalai Lama and his political viewpoint, it'll seem like there's no problems because the Chinese authorities won't arrest somebody in front of you for the most part. They won't break up a conversation, and they won't arrest you. They won't even tell you, you won't even know that something went wrong. But if you discuss with a Tibetan about Tibetan liberation politics or about the Dalai Lama, plainclothes police officers, or even just fellow Tibetans or Chinese that can make a little money from informing, that are just in the area, kind of eavesdropping on you, will get that person in trouble, and you will not know about it. Like, you will talk to that person, think you're having a good conversation, leave on good terms, but at some point in the near immediate future, that person will get in trouble. So if there are any travelers to Tibet, I would say this. Never bring up politics to native Tibetans, because even if you bring it up, they're going to get in trouble and you won't know about it. As oppressive as that is, and sickening as that is, that's the truth. You won't get in trouble, you won't know they get in trouble, but they will get in trouble. Bad trouble, like years in prison type of bad trouble. I would say, if a Chinese person, I would never talk to a Tibetan person about politics, liberation politics. If a Chinese person brings it up to you, and you know they're Chinese and specifically not Tibetan, you might be able to discuss a very basic level of politics, but I would definitely be weary. So yeah, just watch out for that. It's a warning that he specifically gives in this book. Finally, I'll say this. Even though this is only 130 some odd page book, with a bunch of it is heavily noted, heavy glossary, heavy introduction, preamble, acknowledgments, I guess. Even though this is a very slim volume of a book, the penetration of the history as well as the personal aspects of this book really make it highly recommended. I was kind of, this guy teaches at Columbia and is like a big professor. I was kind of worried that it would be too wonkish, too distant, but it really is very accessible, very short, easy read, but also very, very penetrating in its insight, in its relatability, to the way the architecture in Lhasa is, how it relates to the people, how the people see themselves. It's just very, very good. So, Lhasa, Streets with Memories by Robert Barnett. All right, thanks guys. I'll see you around soon.